different crops, which is in terms of different types of vegetables, over 100 different vegetables, around 120 to 140 tons a year. This last 2 or 3 years, we've had exceptionally high yields. We've had some really good crops. We're aiming as far as possible for a system which is completely or as near as possible self-sufficient with a very low carbon footprint. I'll tell you more about that later. We have 5 full-time staff and 2 part-time people. We actually run the business as a community interest company. I no longer own the business. It's shared amongst a group of directors, and we actually work for the local community. So our community really is the people, the customers who come to our shop, who come to our bot scheme, and also advisory clients and seminars. Virtually everything we produce on the farm is sold within a 10-mile or less radius. In fact, over 70% is sold within a 5-mile radius of the farm, and the remainder is within about 10 or 15-mile radius. We're very dependent on local sales. Local sales to us is really important. It's the only way we can make a small farm such as ours work. We do advisory work. I have, until this last 12 months, traveled widely, in fact globally, to many parts of the world, advising on agriculture. We do seminars at the farm, now tend to be more online. We do farm walks. Again, we don't do much of those in the field at the moment, but we are starting again in a few weeks. We have food fairs, and we have a series of trials on the farm, which has been running for quite some decades. Right, just trying to move on. We're not on the best soil in the world. It's a grade 3 sandy loam. Much of our soil is alluvial. It's a mixture of alluvial and glacial. It's very stony. We have 40% stone over 10 millimeters. So we're not on high grade land. This is not really what people would consider to be ideal vegetable growing land. We've had to improve it. It's grade 3C, which puts it in the band of just about possible to grow arable crops in conventional agriculture. We have a pretty good climate. We're around 550 millimeters of rainfall a year, average 65 days per year rain. It's a maritime climate. It's pretty similar to climate for where you guys are based in Bedfordshire. The climate is variable, and it can sometimes be very extreme. We've had some very extreme weather events over the last 10 years. The marketing of our produce is really integral to the whole farm, and we have now got 2 main marketing outlets. We have our bot scheme, which takes around 45%. This is all going to local people within a less than 10-mile radius. And we have a farm shop, which has become increasingly busy. COVID has been quite a game changer for us. It's really ramped up our sales locally, and we've had to really rethink about how we do the farm shop. It's become a very busy place. I'll tell you more about the farm shop later. We have a bot scheme. This is all year round. It's predominantly our own produce, although we do tend to run short. By this time of year, we're now into what we call the hungry gap. So we're sort of scrabbling around. We're actually gleaning in the fields at the minute, trying to find what's left. We've had exceptionally high level of sales this year, and we have tended to run out a little bit earlier than usual. But the bot scheme is very much an important part of our business. It gives us a very good communal link with our customers who have a real interest in what we do on the farm. We have a very good customer base in respect of being able to pick up their vegetables from neighbourhood reps. We deliver to neighbourhood reps in the area. And also we have a range of people from all different demographic groups, which we try to encourage as much as possible. The preserves we also make are primarily from produce which is in excess during the summer. We've had, until recently, we've had problems with too much tomatoes during the summer, so we set up a range of sources. In the last 12 months, our excesses have become less and less because we're selling more and more direct to the public, but we still continue to do our preserves. These are the first ever vegan made on-farm preserves that we know of in the country. I didn't say, but we are registered with the Soil Association, have been for more than 45 years, but we're also registered as stock-free organic with the Vegan Organic Network. This is our farm shop, which we kind of rebuilt 2 or 3 years ago. We had a sort of temporary affair which had done quite well, and we decided we needed to improve our facilities. So we built this. It's all from local timber. In fact, most of the timber actually came from where we live on the estate. We are tenant farmers, so we're able to purchase wood from the estate very cheaply. We milled it ourselves. I did the building. Most of the building is actually either from local timber or from secondhand materials. It's off-grid. We have solar panels and we have water collection, and it's a honesty box. We don't service the shop. It's left to people to come and pick and choose and leave the money, which works incredibly well. It's open 24/7. It never closes. It's been a real game changer in the last year because the community has really rallied around, because suddenly people have decided that food, and particularly local food, is quite important to them, and it's become something of a sort of place to visit on a nice sunny day. This picture was taken last.
Connection is unstable.
This is just some of our pumpkins. We sold over 1,000 pumpkins in 3 weeks this year. It's been incredibly popular with pumpkins this last year. Moving on from here, looking down, we're on the very edge of the Chiltern Hills. In fact, this picture is taken from the Chiltern Hills. We're looking at the very last remnants of Oxfordshire. In the distance, we're looking into Berkshire. You can't quite see the river, but it's the 4th row of trees over. And you'll see at the very bottom of the hill here is 2 of our fields. We have in total just under 20 acres. And one of the fields is divided up into agroforestry. We have 8 rows of trees in there. So we're growing vegetables on a strip system between the trees. We've also got fruit trees within that matrix of trees. The field beyond, there's a small road that goes between them. The field beyond is another 10 acres. And then beyond that, we have the floodplain of the River Thames. In fact, the River Thames comes right up to the very edge of our field. In fact, it was in our field a couple of weeks ago. Just occasionally it comes in for a few days and then recedes again. We don't really want it there for too long because it can be somewhat problematical. It's a very pretty part of the country. We're part of Harburg Estate, which is a 1,000-acre organic estate, and we're tenant farmers, have been there for 33 years. The field cropping is quite extensive. We grow a range of crops. Starting top left, we have potatoes. Unbelievably, potatoes are still an incredibly popular crop in the UK. In fact, we sell more potatoes than anything else. In the last 12 months, we have sold 28 tons of potatoes, and that came from just over an acre of land. It's incredibly good crop for us. It's easy to grow, it's easy to sell. We had a massive spike in potato sales this year because I think people suddenly realized when the pasta sort of ran out on the shelves in supermarkets in March a year ago that actually potatoes weren't such a bad thing after all, and they've tended to go back to potatoes instead of pasta. So potatoes are back on the menu, which I'm quite pleased about because we love growing potatoes. A whole range of brassicas. We've got Brussels sprouts there, Colettes, which is a new crop for us. We've only been growing it for the last 4 years. It's a new crop for UK. Colettes was only invented less than 10 years ago. Onions, bottom right, these are just been harvested. They're drying off in the ground. Squash in the middle. Squash has become a really popular crop for us. We grow a lot of squash. We sold over 7,000 this last year. Leeks, bottom left. These leeks are a great crop for us. They go right the way through almost the whole year. So these are our main, what we call staple crops from the field. To that, we can add carrots and parsnip. And these are staple crops. Most of what we sell is actually what we call staple vegetables: potatoes, carrots, onions, leeks, brassica, squash. Here we've got some crops coming off the field. This is potatoes. That trailer there takes about 3 tons of potatoes, and we filled up 10 of those last year. Bottom picture is onions. We had an exceptionally good crop year before last, not quite so good last year, but we're still using relatively traditional methods of onion storage. We don't have any high technically advanced storage for potatoes or onions. We're using quite basic storage principles which work for us on our scale. Squash, again, I'd say very popular, and these are grown within a living mulch. I'll tell you more about that later, but squash have been a real bonus to us. We've now made it a staple crop. It's been an incredibly good few years with squash, and customers are really supportive. We get a lot of sales now with squash, whereas when we first started growing them 30 odd years ago, we had a job to give them away. Now we can sell everything we produce. And then very close to the field is the wall garden. This is a very old wall garden. It's been in use for well over 1,000 years. This was originally the wall garden to Harwick House, which you can see behind the greenhouses. Harwick House is Toad Hall. This is where Kenneth Grahame wrote Wind in the Willows. So we are in Wind in the Willows country. This is where Mr. Toad used to live. Mr. Toad was my landlord's great grandfather. During the war, this was heavily invested in the gardens. It all went into glass. Virtually the whole garden, which is 2 acres, was under glass as part of the Dig for Victory war effort. When I took it on, much of it was derelict. We had a huge amount of old glass to clear away. The wall garden, we use it primarily for what we call minor crops. So things like courgettes, beans, tomatoes, peppers, a lot of greenhouse and tunnel cropping, very extensive use in greenhouses of long-term cropping. It's very sheltered, it's very warm. We have the same principles in the garden as we have in the field. It's stock-free organic. We don't use any animal manures. I'll tell you more about how that works in a minute. Range of crops in the garden. Lettuce are very popular. We grow about 25,000 lettuce every year. We're actually planting and sowing around 1,000 lettuce every week, starting, well, we've already started. We start in February. Strawberries, we've reintroduced strawberries. We used to grow a lot of strawberries many years ago, and then we gave up for various reasons, one being the difficulty of finding labour. We think we've sorted that out. Well, we thought we had, but we're not sure we have. But last year we picked over 2 tons of strawberries. It was our best year ever. It's a really great crop. It's a wonderful crop to start the season with. It kind of fills the end of the hungry gap for us. And then in tunnels, we grow a huge range of different crops, but over winter, the bottom right is salad crops. We grow a lot of salads. These are really popular during the winter, particularly from sort of September right through till the end of this month, really. And then we go into more traditional crops. And then beetroot to leaf beaten chard. Tunnels are very intensively cropped. So we're cropping all year round. We never stop. There's no resting period really at all. We do have some very short-term green manures, but mostly we're feeding tunnel crops with wood chip compost, which we make on the farm. We grow around 35 different vegetable crops in tunnels. It's very intensive. Bottom right, you see carrots. These were sown. We sowed carrots 2 weeks ago. They're just coming up today, and we'll expect to harvest those by the middle of May. Bottom right, we have fennel, and then we have tomatoes. Tomatoes, you'll see, are actually growing in a living mulch, in a mulch of clovers and legumes. Food fairs, we do a lot of food fairs. We haven't done any for last year because of the COVID situation, but we enjoy having a fair. The Squash Festival is one of our biggest. We had over 2,000 people in 2019, and we hope to be able to resume that again this year. It's a great family event. The idea really is to try and educate the public really about food. People are really quite not well educated about food. Nobody really gets taught about food at school, which is a great shame. So we're in a position where we feel we need to try and let people know a bit more about how we grow their food, how we manage the farm. So we invite them onto the farm. We have regular farm walks for customers. And within the seasonal calendar, we have several food events: Squash Festival, Strawberry Fair, and Mulberry Fair. We've had a lot of work over many, many years with trials and surveys. In fact, we go back more than 30 years doing trials, and we've done trials into a whole range of different things, and we continue to do trials. This was our trial list for 2019, and it was pretty similar for last year. We have amassed a huge amount of data over many, many years on this particular site. In fact, we have probably more data on this site in terms of biological diversity and soil nutrients, and a whole range of, we have hedgehog surveys and bat surveys and a whole range of different surveys. And this really gives us a really interesting picture of how the farm functions, because as you'll see in a minute, the farm is very much a biological function. It's not just a food production unit. So we've done trials into the agroforestry, which is ongoing. We're measuring the flora and fauna. We have wonderful people come around counting beetles. We've had huge beetle counts. We've got the most incredible diverse range of beetles in our fields. We're looking at green manures and earthworm populations. Our last earthworm count done last year was our best ever. We have, and I have to brag, I'm afraid, we have over 13 million earthworms per hectare. And this equates to 1,300 for every square meter of land. This is a staggering figure, which we are really quite happy about, because the earthworms for us are really important. We have a lot of trials into different varieties. We're looking at Ramuel wood chip, which I'll tell you more about later. Propagation media, we produce our own propagation media. This is for growing transplants, and also looking at alternative cropping. All the pictures, by the way, are taken on the farm. Right, the farm is very much a biological function, and we operate a systems approach, and I won't dwell too long on this, but it's really important that people understand something about the fact that the system is integral to the way we operate the whole farm. And systems, like any other system, we have systems in our computers, in our cars, in our homes, and our farm is very much a system, and it's a complex whole set of connected things or parts. We don't look at pest and disease or fertility in a negative way. We look at very much in a positive way, and we look upon it in the way of how we consider it within the whole farm function, and not something which is looked at in isolation. So pest, disease, fertility are all part and parcel of the same thing. You cannot separate them out. And we try to encourage growers to understand and consider the whole system rather than looking at things in little boxes. And this is where agriculture has gone mostly wrong in the past, because it kind of tried to dissect agriculture into little boxes and separate bits out. You cannot do that. Agriculture is dependent on a biological function and a biological system, and you cannot separate one from the other, because everything is interdependent on everything else. So we try to encourage this concept of the farm as being a biological function, and we need this systems approach in order to make the farm operate in a satisfactory manner. So we're looking at biodiversity, and when I first started farming, to me, biodiversity, I don't even know if I even knew what the word meant. I certainly didn't hear it. It wasn't really a word which was used very much back in the 70s. I suppose it was around, but I don't remember hearing it. So I didn't grow up knowing about biodiversity. I had to learn as I went. We look at our farm as a biological function, and we look at our farm as one which produces biological diversity. And the biodiversity of our farm is the main driver. Everything we do on the farm is really geared towards biodiversity. And the vegetables and the fruits that we grow are a byproduct of that, rather than the other way around. Rather than looking at vegetables and thinking, well, we'll tack on a few trees here or plant a few wildflowers there. That's not the way we operate. Biodiversity comes first, and then the vegetables come second to that. So we put biodiversity at the very heart of the farm. And I divided it up into three, I hope, slightly easier to understand components, and that is the soil, the understory, and the heavy carbon. And I'll go into that now. So for us, soil is the ultimate biodiversity. There is nothing more complex than soil. We have very little understanding of soil. Soil until recently was something which most people only considered in a chemical form. Very few people really looked at soil in the biological way. One of the first ever scientists to really think about soil in its biological function was Charles Darwin, who looked very closely at the earthworm. And I get a lot of my inspiration from the earthworm, because I read Charles Darwin's book on the earthworm. It's a fascinating account. And through understanding earthworms, I have a really, I have a basic but a biological understanding of where soil is and how it performs and how it can be increased and how it can be improved. So organic matter is really important. Now we put on organic matter, not huge amounts. We're very modest, but we use it in a very specific way. We grow a huge range of different plant types, not just through different cropping, but also through green manures. We have at least 30 or 40 different green manures growing. We use very minimal tillage. We do very little deep ploughing. In fact, we don't do any deep ploughing at all. We do very shallow cultivations. We never till more than about 5 inches deep, and then only very occasionally. We have minimal tillage, and everything we do really is about trying to preserve the earthworm, because we know that for every earthworm that survives, our soil improves. And the idea is to retain and increase the level of carbon in the soil. And we've been able to do that even with quite extensive cropping and quite high yields. We've been able to show that we can actually increase the carbon in the soil and produce food at the same time. There's a lot of claims going around about various forms of agriculture that can increase carbon. And yes, you can increase carbon by putting down grass and having a few animals, but you don't produce much food in the process. We have to feed a growing population. We have to continue to feed people. So our brief really, if you like, as farmers, is to increase food production, but also to increase carbon content in the soil. And this is really something we're concentrating a lot on. The picture on the bottom right is a very good example of an earthworm cast. And I've just yesterday, before it started raining today, I've actually cultivated some ground, which had been into a grass clover ley for several years as part of our fertility building. And the top centimetre of the complete field was entirely covered in earthworm cast as a result of earthworms feeding on the organic matter that we feed them. So feeding the soil with green manures, we've used green manures as the main soil fertility component, because we can grow it on the farm. We don't have to bring it in. If we were bringing manure in from another farm, we would have to pay for that material. It would invariably be coming from a non-organic farm, because organic farmers do not sell their manure. Understandably, they want to keep it for themselves. So we would be, in fact, it is allowed that organic farms can bring manure from non-organic farms. There are conditions about that, but it is allowed. But what we would be doing if we were doing that, we would actually be bringing in fertility from somebody else's land, which I think is not good, it's not ethical, it's not correct, because fertility should be going back to that farm itself. And if we were to bring in animal manures, we would actually be ultimately importing vast amounts of feed, which come from somewhere else in the world, which goes to feed those animals to build that fertility onto our farm. And this is something we don't think is ethically sound. We want to use our farm as a means of supporting fertility for our vegetable growing. We do not wish to be dependent on somebody else's farm somewhere else on the planet for our fertility. So we've got, as far as possible, a very closed system. It's not 100% closed, but we're gradually closing it more and more. We recycle all the nutrients on the farm. We don't lose nutrients. We're very aware of the possible loss of nutrients. When you stop importing fertility, you have to look after your own nutrients. And we've done a lot to do that. We keep ground covered all the time. We're cropping up to 70% of our land area. So it's not as if we've got huge swathes of our farm sitting around just growing pretty plants for most of the time. We are cropping it quite high. 70% is very good, considering the land is not of the best possible quality. So we use a lot of clovers, but it's not just clovers. We have a whole range of different plants. In fact, our fertility building ley, you'll see the top right picture. This is what we call a fertility building ley. It will be down for 2 years. It contains a lot of clovers, lucerne, red and white clovers, sainfoin, but it also contains about 25 different wildflowers. And those wildflowers are really important, because our green manures are not just about feeding the soil, it's also about feeding biodiversity. So the green manures, being a very important fertility builder, but they're equally as important in terms of building biodiversity. We need biodiversity. We need as many insects as possible. We need as much fungi and bacteria in the soil as we can possibly find, because that's what drives a biological function. We farm carbon. As farmers, that's what we do. We take carbon out, we turn it into food, we put it back. We use the process of photosynthesis through plants to regenerate the carbon that we use. And that's a fair exchange. So what we take out, we make sure we put back. And what we've actually managed to do, we've actually managed to put back just a little bit more than we've taken out. It's not huge, but it is significant. And in terms of the actual carbon we've put back into our soil over the last 30 years, it's a lot of carbon. I'll look at some detail about that a bit later on. We're using various techniques which I've pioneered. I just realized my battery's going to go out in a minute. I've got to find my plug and plug in. I don't want to suddenly disappear. Right. Let's hope this is, yeah, that's it, right. Okay, so we've pioneered a lot of techniques on the farm. In order to increase the amount of green manure we have in the system, we've pioneered a process which I call relay green manuring, where we can actually put green manures into a living crop. So what we do, we can have a crop and we can have a green manure at the same time. So the green manure is there to build fertility, to encourage insects, it improves soil fauna and fertility. It will also help to control weeds. It also gives protection to the soil. Bare soil in the winter is the best way of losing nutrient. We've all seen bare fields in the winter, and Bedfordshire's full of them, particularly where they've been growing maize. And often, huge amount of soil is lost during the winter through erosion. There's a lot of soil damage gets done. The earthworms disappear. Leaving soil over winter without protection is the worst possible thing that you could ever do to soil. The old gardeners, and still some young ones, I'm afraid to say, still think you have to dig your garden in the autumn and leave it bare over winter. This is the worst possible thing you can do. You lose all your fertility, you damage the biological diversity of the soil, and you get erosion. So we're really keen to keep soil covered. So we use this process of relay green manure in order to get green manure on the ground to cover the crops between the rows where there may be some bare soil. And this gives us long-term soil stability, but it also improves the bacteria and the fungi in the soil. Every plant, every different species of plant has its own set of bacteria and fungi which inhabit the roots of the plant. And these fungi and bacteria are really important in terms of soil health. They're all interrelated, they all work for and with each other. They're a whole huge community of bacteria and fungi. And in order to improve that bacteria and fungi, we need a big range of plants. And this is where green manures come in as part of that process. This is how our green manure looks in the spring. This picture would be taken sometime around end of April, early May. You can hear this. You can hear it from 100 yards away. You can hear the buzz. You can hear the noise. It's not just what you see or smell, you can hear it. And this is doing a lot of good. There's a lot of insects in it. The more insects we have on our farm, the better we like it. So we allow flowers to grow, we allow them to flower and even to set seed. And we've actually increased our flora. We've increased our flora by adding weed seeds to our mixes of green manure in order to increase the biodiversity. We're not paranoid about weed seed banks. We're quite happy. We coexist with weeds. We can tolerate weeds in the right places at the right time. And it brings in a huge range of biodiversity. This is such a joy to see in the spring. And we have flowers in the field pretty much all the year from now, well, end of this month, right up until October, November, there's something flowering somewhere. Here we have an example of relay green manure where we've got courgettes growing between rows of clover, and there'll be mixed clovers with some wildflowers there. These plants coexist quite happily in this way. The understory, now we're moving on to the understory, which is where we're growing green manures within living crops. And here we've got sweet corn on the left and squash on the right. And the squash are quite happy to grow within this matrix of green manures, which we sow sometime during the early summer, about 4 weeks after planting. And this green manure will be in the ground for a further 2 years. This is the start of what we call the fertility building part of the rotation. The understory is really important to what we do. As part of that, we have beetle banks. So we have a range of these right across our field. They're roughly every 50 to 60 meters apart. They're usually 2 to 3 meters wide. They include a range of different flowers. It varies from year to year. Some we've had for very long term. Some we've had in place for more than 10 or 15 years. Some we change every 2 to 3 years. We have different formula of different flowers, different plants. Some we use mostly perennials, some we use annuals. The idea is to form a grid system within the field through which insects can move. They can pupate, they can continue with their life cycle, and it helps to bring the edge of the field, which is the hedgerows and the field margins, into the crop itself. So none of our vegetables are growing very far from a source of rich biodiversity. So we've integrated biodiversity in with in with the cropping. And it's this understory which is so important to us. And Beetle Banks are one of our big carbon fixers. We get a lot of carbon from our Beetle Banks. Where we're growing green manures, so about 30% of our farm is growing these crops of green manure, which are a mixture of legumes, flowers, and various other things. Where we're mowing it, because we mow it, the idea of mowing it is to put it back to the ground and let the earthworms flourish, but we also leave strips which we don't mow because they're really rich, important areas for wildlife. So we don't want to destroy all the habitat that we've created. So we're leaving areas to flourish and to flower. And this is how it would look later in the year. And then we're allowing some crops to grow. Everybody, we have farm walks a lot, and everybody always wants to know, how do we manage cabbage white butterflies? And I say, well, we don't have problems with them. We never have cabbage white butterflies because we manage brassicas in a very specific way, which encourages parasitic wasps, and the parasitic wasps live on the caterpillar. So we have a system which is self-perpetuating, and all we have to do is manage the environment that the cabbage white, the parasite of the caterpillar likes to be around. So we manage their environment really to our benefit, and that helps other insects too. But allowing brassicas to flower after harvest, this is cabbages, which people don't realize, but if you leave a cabbage after you've cut it, it will regrow, form a huge plant, which is full of flowers, full of insects, and full of the parasites that live on the cabbage white butterfly. We mow it after it goes back in the ground, it produces carbon. Weeds are a really important part of our understory, and we tolerate weeds in a different way, perhaps from other growers. We have a zero tolerance in the early stages of crop establishment, but once the crop is well established, we're quite happy to let weeds grow because they cover the ground, they create places for insects to hang out. Here we've got a couple of shield bugs here, and nettles. This is an example of nettle. Nettles are one of the best ways of encouraging predatory insects. We have zero problems with aphids or whitefly or red spider mite because we allow these nettles to grow in the right place. We don't have them in crops, but around the borders, in the hedgerows, in the beetle banks. And field boundaries are really important. We have a lot of boundary. We're quite small fields. We've only got 2 fields, 17 acres in total. And we've got 1,900 linear meters of hedgerow. It's a very rich source of biodiversity. We've planted a lot of trees in it, but also we encourage the wildflowers there to grow because they are part and parcel of the whole biological function. So the understory of hedgerows is critical to what we do. Then we move on to heavy carbon. Heavy carbon is the sort of the woodwork, if you like, of the biological function of our land. We've planted a lot of trees, and excuse me, I just turned this off a minute. We've planted a lot of trees over many years. This is not one I planted, but this one is planted over 100 years ago. We see trees as an integral part of the farm, and we use them in a very specific way. We actually use trees as part of our production system. We have hedges. We were the first farm, it's a rather sad story this, I'm afraid, but we were the first farm to plant a hedge in our parish for 125 years. And we did this some 30 odd years ago. Most hedges, a lot of hedges had been taken out. We did it over 30 years ago. It's now very well established. This picture was actually taken over 20 years ago, but the hedge is now very productive. We coppice it every 6 or 7 years, and that material goes into wood chip, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But we use hedges in a very specific way on the farm. And then the shelter belts. This was one we planted 20 years ago. In fact, this is a very old picture. This was done just a few years after planting. We planted over 250 meters of shelter belt with a range of different trees. Some of them are fruit trees, but mostly indigenous trees. They're now very productive. We're also using those as a source of fertility. So as well as getting shelter from the wind, a fantastic range of insects, wonderful bird life, we're also getting carbon, and this carbon is helping to grow our crops. And I'll show you in a little while how that works. So here we've got wood chip compost. This is just a part of our fertility cycle. We have rotations, we have crop diversity, we have green manures and we have wood chip. Now, some of this wood chip we're composting. Some of this is coming from our own trees. So we're using our hedgerows in the rotation coppice. So we cut them roughly every 6 to 7 years. It gets chipped up. Some we use fresh, as Ramuel chip wood. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. We're also bringing some in from our neighbour, who's a tree surgeon. He works in the local area within the estate. And often we get quite large loads of wood chip coming from him. It's an incredibly useful resource. We turn it every 3 to 4 months and we produce the most incredible compost. Everybody thinks you have to be mad to try and make compost out of wood chip, but it works incredibly well. We get some beautiful material from this. In fact, we use it for propagation. Here we've got Ramuel chip wood. So we've pioneered the use of Ramuel chip wood. Ramuel chip wood is different from the material we're composting. This is done during the winter. And here we got a wood chipper, which is chipping some of our coppice. We have a small area of coppice we planted in a wet piece of land, and we're producing around between 30 and 40 cubic meters of wood chip every year from that piece of land. And that goes on to our green manure crops as fresh chipped wood. It gets done during the winter. And what you're looking at in the bottom right is the chip being applied to the green manure. It goes on quite thinly. It's about 7 millimeters deep. It's 70 cubic meters per hectare, so it's quite a modest amount. It's a small amount, but it has a disproportionately large effect on the soil. We've seen some incredibly big changes in our soil since we've been using wood chip. We've seen a massive increase in earthworm populations. We have mycorrhiza in the soil, which we didn't have before. We have much better fertility. We have nutrient levels which are much healthier than they've ever been before. We have an increase in organic matter. Everything about this has been really positive, and it's basically it's free. We grow it. There's a cost involved in the chipping and the spreading, but it's relatively low. This has been the best thing that our farmers ever done, actually, in all the time that we've been farming. And we've been doing this now for wood chip. We've been using now for 15 years, and we've really seen some incredible benefits. Here we have the coppice, which I planted some 20 years ago. It was willow from a local source. Top right, you can see this is where we're cutting it. We cut one row every year. We've got 7 rows, so it works quite nicely. And the bottom right is how it looks after about 5 or 6 years. It's incredibly productive, but not only does it produce carbon, it's also producing nesting sites for birds. We have willow warblers now living here. It produces a huge range of different insects and is also encouraging a wild forest to regenerate. Between these trees, we now have oak. We've got 7 or 8 different species of tree, which is just growing naturally, and we're leaving them where we can. We've got hornbeam, which we haven't seen on the estate ever, but it seems to come in on its own. So we're seeing a complete change in the way this bit of land is now regenerating. And it's a piece of land which we couldn't farm. It was too wet. It floods in the winter. And it's been incredibly productive in the form of trees. So I've made a very close link between agroforestry, carbon, and how we grow vegetables. And something I'd never seen before. I hadn't realized that the link between healthy, productive farmland is actually in the forests. And agriculture and forestry have always lived side by side, but there's no interaction between the two. They're completely divorced from each other, in the same way that arable farms are completely divorced from other types of farm. There's no integration at all. So we're really looking at bringing trees back to the farm in a much more proactive way. We've done a lot of work on our carbon footprint, and it's a big subject, and we've been using Farm Carbon Toolkit, which was developed by farmers for farmers. And it's really to encourage farmers to try and reduce their emissions, improve their resilience to energy, and also to improve their farming system. And it really focuses your attention very clearly on where you may be wasting carbon and where you may be consuming far too much. And there's some very sound economic reasons for doing this, as well as good climate and environmental reasons. And we've done this a couple of times. It's been very revealing. We learned an awful lot about our farm through doing this. analysis. It's quite complex, it's quite time consuming. We don't do it every year, but we would like to. And we've come up with various pictures, and they can be tweaked by all and sundry, but we've got a reasonably good idea of where our farm is. We know pretty much where our energy goes. We know how much we use for production. And what we're looking at here is the complete and total farm. This is everything on the farm. This is from the farm to the consumer, because we're also putting in the delivery, because we deliver produce to our customers. We're putting in all the electricity we use, the materials we use. This is materials for packaging, building materials get calculated, and also things like green manures, because some green manures give off nitrogen oxide, which is not good for the climate, as well as putting carbon in. They can also give out some nasties, and also materials for waste management. So we're looking at the whole area of farm carbon use and seeing really just how much do we actually use, and what can we do about that. And then we're looking at the sequestration, and these figures, these are probably not 100% accurate. They were accurate at the time. We've just recently done a new study which has come up with some different figures, but the science of monitoring carbon footprints on farms and indeed in households is improving all the time. It's getting better. So we looked at where we may possibly be reducing carbon and saving carbon, and hedges, because we have a lot of hedge, it produces a lot of carbon. We have coppice. The coppice is quite significant, although it's a very small part of the farm. It produces a lot of carbon. Field margins. The really big one is the soil organic matter increase. And this has taken over a long-term average of what we're increasing in terms of soil carbon. We've gone with our fields from about 3.2% to 5.5% in the last 30 years. It doesn't sound particularly, doesn't sound terribly exciting, but actually it's a very, very large amount of actual carbon in the soil. So we're looking at this as an annual figure. So in that particular year, we had a very favourable sequestration of 21 tonnes and emissions of 16. So we had a balance of over 4 tonnes. However, it's not like every year. We've only got to go and buy a brand new tractor, which we don't do, we buy secondhand. But if we were to buy a brand new tractor, we would end up with a massive deficit of carbon, because everything we buy on the farm gets logged in the carbon study. So we do write off machinery over a period of time, but it takes 10 years to do that. Just finally, because we're running out of time, this is the final picture, really, just to remind me we've got to the end. This is our farm shop. I told you about it earlier. It's been a wonderful experience. It's brought the customer very much to the farm. We somehow timed it absolutely perfectly to be ready a year before COVID came along, because COVID has actually done us a big favour. It's been enormously difficult for a lot of people, but for us on the farm, it's actually really brought customers to us, and it's reinstated the importance of local food in the local community, which is something a lot of people hadn't really realised. And now we feel quite privileged actually to be part of that community in terms of food production. This is what we've always wanted to be. It's taken a long time to get there. It's a great shame that COVID had to come along to make people aware of some of these issues, but it certainly has made a big difference to the way our farm runs. And our future really is very much about feeding people locally, feeding people from a farm which has a very low, or in some years a positive carbon footprint rather than negative carbon footprint, and doing it in a way which encourages biodiversity, increases the life of the farm and the surrounding area. So that is, in a nutshell, our farm. It's very diverse. It's very complex. It's a very beautiful place. I'm blessed with having wonderful staff. We have the most amazing people working here, and I have support of my family, and I have a daughter working on the farm, and I have grandchildren who are now working on the farm. One grandchild now working on the farm. So we feel quite lucky to be part of this community. Right, that I think is the end of my presentation. I've come to the end of my time.
Iain, thank you very much for that. That's excellent timekeeping. If you ever need a second job, I think perhaps running the railways might be useful. can I just say to our audience that we've now opened up the chat function, and if you have any questions you want to pose, then please do pop those in there, and we'll be selecting those questions and going from there. While those questions start coming through to me, Iain, I just wanted to ask you a couple of topics which I don't remember you actually specifically talking about. One is the question of biochar. It's come onto our radar in the last 12 months or so. Is it on your radar, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, very much so. We've done some trials actually into biochar. We did some trials looking at the addition of biochar to our propagation substrates a few years ago. These are proper trials done with research organisation. For us, the jury's out. We didn't gain any significant, or in fact, any statistically significant advantage in using biochar. One of the problems of biochar, really, I suppose, is the production. We did wonder if there would be some real benefits in terms of soil, and I think there could well be on soils which are perhaps quite badly eroded and impoverished. But on our ground, there was no improvement at all. I think probably because our soil is already in very good condition. So I wouldn't say it doesn't work. It didn't really work for us. It's certainly not in a trial situation, but I don't mean to say it doesn't have some future.
Okay. And the other question was seed saving. Obviously, we've come across the delightful Vandana Shiva over the last few years, and of course she sort of very much advocates soil seed sovereignty and moving away from the big global corporations that control it. Is that something that that you look to do at all, or do you rely on buying your seeds in every year from the industry?
Yeah, we do. It's something we're very conscious about. We do save some seed. In fact, we do grow some seed for one of the seed companies. I have done for quite some years. Seed saving can be complex. Give you an example. We grow 12 or 14 different varieties of squash. We wouldn't be able to save seed because they cross-pollinate. We'd have to have at least a mile between each variety, and that on our farm is not possible. There are some practical difficulties with growing seed as well as growing crops, and seed is usually grown as a separate crop. And where we have grown seed, and we do parsnip and one or two others, we grow them as a separate crop. There's also a financial disadvantage because we know from experience that growing seed is actually more expensive for us than buying it in, partly because of the high cost of labour. If we were to grow all of our 300 different varieties of seed for like an entire farm, which includes green manures as well, we would have to employ a person full time, and that wouldn't be cost effective. So it works in some ways. We would love to grow more seed. We only buy seed, it has to be organic. We're not allowed to buy, well, we can only buy non-organic seed if we cannot get it as organic, and we have to get derogation. But we only buy from relatively small companies. They are family operated companies. We don't buy seed through multinational companies. I know what you're saying about Vandana. In agriculture, it's a different situation. If we were an arable farmer, we may only be growing 5 crops and we would be saving our own seed. It would be easy because we're combining those crops. But to save vegetable seed is very problematical in this climate as well. So we do some, but not as much as we would like to do, and we don't do more primarily for financial reasons.
Okay, the seed cooperative, who are now based up in Boston, are they on your horizon? Do they supply you with seeds at all?
Yes, about 80% of our seed comes from them. We spend over £7,000 a year on seed, and yes, the bulk of it comes from them. We actually supply them as well. We have grown seed for them too. So we are part of a movement of growers who help to support the seed co-op. We very much like the idea of the seed co-op, and we have tried to put most of our business through them as much as we can in the last few years. We do support very much their initiative.
Well, we've got an audience which stretches well beyond the borders of Bedfordshire, including Gertrude Cazot from Bruges in Belgium. And the question that's being posed here is that in the beginning, you said that the soil was very poor and that you had to improve it. How did you do that in the beginning?
Primarily through rotations, through lots of green manures. We didn't use, in the first 15 years on this land, we didn't use any organic applications at all other than green manure. So we weren't using wood chip. We've never used manure. So we were doing it through green manures, and we made some very substantial improvements, primarily through green manures and rotations.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. A question here which asks, saying that you grow a wonderful range of crops. Is it possible to grow enough pulses in the UK for the protein element of our diet? Is that something you can address?
Yes, we wouldn't be growing pulses because it's an arable crop, and it wouldn't fit into our farm. You need quite large areas of land to grow pulses. But yes, there's no reason at all why UK couldn't be growing a lot more pulses. And this is starting to happen. Hobby Dodds, a company in Suffolk, who are encouraging farmers to grow pulses. They do quite a range of organic and non-organic pulses. Lentils are now being grown in the UK. Chickpeas are now being grown. We have, until this year, we've been growing dry pilotti beans every year, but we've stopped growing them now because they're not worth very much. So an acre of pilotti beans for us is only worth about maybe £1,000, whereas an acre of strawberries is worth £20,000. So these crops are very low value, so they don't fit within a horticultural rotation, but they fit very well within an arable farm rotation, and we're very keen to see more of that. Hemp is another crop which would fit in with that pulse rotation as well.
Okay, more questions are coming in here. This one is regarding animal manure. It says, can you say more about what you'd say to those who say animal manure is needed for soil fertility? Well, I think you've covered that pretty much, really, haven't you? But then the follow-up question is, could you comment on how scalable your model is? Incidentally, this gentleman, Mr. Gorman, says that it's a fabulous talk, so thank you very much for that. What, in terms of scalability, is it a question of replication rather than increasing in scale? In other words, having other farms of your sort of size, as opposed to for you growing onto, say, 200 acres or something like that? I
would prefer to see replication, but there's no technical or agronomic reason why it couldn't be scaled up much larger. This could be 1,000 acres. It wouldn't be one field. It'd be lots of small fields. The market really drives what we do. So we've geared our production to suit our local market. We could actually double our area tomorrow. Well, we couldn't because it takes longer than tomorrow to do it, but we could double our area over the next 3 or 4 years, perhaps. Because we have that sort of capacity in terms of market. So we could do that. We don't have access to enough land at the moment. This is one of our problems. We would like to have more. So it can be scaled up. It would have to incorporate all the systems we have. So in terms of rotation and hedgerows and beetle banks and biodiversity, all those things would have to be present. It would be on a much larger scale. The fields would be relatively small. You wouldn't do this in one big field. You'd have to do it in a big field divided up into lots of smaller fields. And there are some, I hate to say it, but there are some real advantages in scaling up in terms of cost of equipment and machinery. You know, whenever we start to grow a crop on a larger scale, the cost comes down quite dramatically because we can semi or completely mechanize that crop. And we do use mechanization. We have to because there isn't enough labor to do these sort of jobs. One of our biggest single expense on the farm is labor. It's one thing we spend more on than anything else. So we are always careful to be able to make sure we can pay that labor. But at the end of the day, we do look at a certain economy of scale in order to make it work. And we're probably about as small as you could possibly be, yet still be economically viable. You know, it could easily be scaled up. There's no problem with that at all. Do you use woofers? You know, these sort of organic volunteers on a seasonal basis? Because a lot of small scale
organic operations do use woofers, where basically they provide them with bed and board for a few weeks, a few months, and in return they get you get, I don't know, 25, 30 hours of labour out of them each year. Do you rely on that, or have any of that as an element of your operation?
Not now. We have done in the past. What we were doing until a couple of years ago, we haven't used woofers for probably 25 years, but what we have done over the last 20 years, and we've only stopped doing it in the last 2, is we've run a training program where we take people as internees, we train them. They come for a very specific period of time. They come for 12 weeks. There's 2 periods each year. We take 2 people. We don't treat them as volunteers. They come to learn. There has been a program of learning through either through me directly or from our other staff. And there's a set program of educational events and seminars which they attend as well. So we like to think of that as a way of improving people's knowledge. We do get some work out of them, of course, but we also give an awful lot back. So it's a two-way exchange. We don't have people volunteering, spending weeks on end in the field pulling weeds. We don't have that sort of weed problem. We can manage it without volunteers. A lot of small farms do rely quite heavily on volunteers, and it's understandable given that very small farms are usually not economically viable. It's very difficult to make a small farm a viable unit, and that's something we have been able to do over the last decade, and it has meant that we can actually employ everybody and pay them beyond minimum wage. And we house most of our staff as well, provide all their facilities.
Okay, I mean, one of the things which keeps cropping up for me is the type of training that young people that move into agriculture and horticulture get. I mean, we have a agricultural college here in Bedfordshire, Shuttleworth College, which has got quite a good reputation. What's your view? I mean, would a student in their early 20s who's done their 2, 3, 4 years, or whatever it is, at a college like that, would they be able to come on to start their own operation, if you like, along the lines that you do, or is the training that they're getting really aimed at big horticulture, sort of 200 acres of broccoli or 50 acres of cauliflower or something?
Yes, I mean, Shuttleworth, I do know it quite well, and other colleges of that type tend to train people for very large farm environments, and as you say, they may well be working on a farm with 100 acres of asparagus or broccoli. There may only be 3 or 4 crops on that farm. It's a completely different scenario to what we're doing, which is very, very diverse and very rich and incredibly complicated in terms of management. This takes a considerable amount of experience to manage. It would be very much easier if we only grew 3 crops, but that's not something I want to do. I don't think it's very good for the environment. It could be done organically, but I still don't think it's right. So most of the training that people get at those colleges is not suitable to the sort of farm that we would like to see becoming more a part of the agricultural landscape of UK. I mean, we have a very high stocking rate of employees per acre compared with those very large farms. So we think this is also quite important. And one of the big challenges we actually face as a farm business is finding people with skills to do this. This has been our biggest problem in the last few years, getting people with skills. We have a core group of staff here now who we've been sort of training for quite some time. It's taken quite a lot of effort to do this. People often don't stay for very long. They might only do it for a year or 2, then they go off and do something different. We've got a group of people now who are very keen to stay. In fact, they've started having babies, so that's quite a good sign. So it is something which takes a very large commitment, and it needs to be an education package which really takes into account the diversity and the biological diversity of what we do, because this is something which Shuttleworth would probably hardly touch on at all, because farms generally are very big. We have the largest farms in Europe, in the UK.
It seems to me, I mean, I'm sure my fellow committee members wouldn't advocate cloning as such, but it seems to me that there's a case to be made for cloning Iain Tolhurst. What?
Well, yeah, you wouldn't want too many of me around, I'm afraid. Yes, I mean, I'm at a time in my life, but I have to think about the long term. I am past retirement age, but I have no intention of retiring. I am cultivating the next generations of farmers for here, which is one of the reasons we ran training programs, was to try and encourage people to do this as a long-term career. There's an enormous number of young people who want to get into to do something similar to what we're doing. They lack the training facilities, they lack the experience, and the biggest threat actually to all this is probably one to do with housing. Rural housing is a serious problem. We've had to create living spaces for people here so people can live on the farm, because nobody could afford to pay the rents that would normally be around in this area is almost as much as the agricultural wage. So this is a serious problem for the future to be addressed along with climate change, is how we're going to get people on the land and how we're going to house them, because this is one of the big critical factors.
Have you had to build new accommodation, and if so, has the local planning authority been helpful or more of a hindrance in that regard?
The planners have actually been quite good. They were very supportive of this shop, which we had to get permission for. We've created 2 other places as well, which they've also supported. We haven't had a problem, but we are a very long established business with a very good track record in the community, and that obviously helps. I think if you move on to a piece of land and you instantly apply for permission to build a house, you're going to get refused because they want to see what you're going to be able to produce. We have that ability to do that, so we've been able to develop what we needed, but that's not true of every situation. We are in an area of outstanding natural beauty. It could be very difficult to get permission for where we are, and they are quite cautious about even allowing us to put up buildings, but they have had to because of the nature of our business and the fact we do employ quite a few people as well. That has been very much in our favor. So in many cases you are put to test in terms of what your business can offer in terms of the future production and future in terms of employment as well.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for that. This is a technical question from Oliver Rubenstein. He says, as part of the farm carbon toolkit, do you need to take soil samples to measure the soil carbon, or is it just assumed values? How does that measurement of carbon in the soil work?
Yeah, it's a very good question. We have to do soil analysis. We do very extensive soil analysis. In fact, we have literally hundreds and hundreds of analyses over the years, partly because we're involved in long-term trials looking specifically at our carbon content, but also some of the other trials that we've done rely very much on carbon analysis. So yes, we need to do that on a regular basis. It has to be done from certain parts of the field. The figures we come up with we know are not 100% accurate. They couldn't possibly be, but they do give a fairly good representation of what's going on with carbon. It is probably fairly likely at some point in the future that farmers will have to start measuring carbon much more regularly, and they will possibly, I would hope, be getting paid for carbon storage as well, because agriculture has got a huge potential for storing carbon. We know that a lot of the carbon in the atmosphere could be put back, because it came from the land originally, could be put back in the land. The difficulty is growing crops at the same time, and what we've been able to prove, I think, on our farm is that is possible. You can grow crops and you can store carbon, although it takes longer to do it that way.
Okay. Another interesting question here. Would this system work for cereal crops? I think perhaps what the gentleman is getting at here is what techniques that you use would be relevant to, say, a typical cereal farmer, because obviously here in Bedfordshire, a huge amount of our agricultural land is dedicated to cereals.
Yeah, very much so. Incidentally, only 30% of all the cereals grown in this country actually go for human consumption. The rest goes into feeding animals. So if we were to take out just half of that cereal production and reduce our animal usage, then we would release a huge amount of land for other things. But yes, there's no reason why we couldn't be growing cereals on the same system without livestock. It would be a green manure system. We'd have a rotation of maybe 4, 5, possibly 6 different cereal crops. There would be 1 or 2 pulses within that. We may even be growing some sunflowers if we're in the south. So there's very good possibilities. In fact, I am working with a farm in Eastern Europe doing system identical to ours, but using arable crops on quite a large scale. This is on many hundreds of hectares, and it has got some great potential. There have been trials done. ADAS Terrington, one of the research farms in Norfolk, ran a stockless trial for 6 or 7 years back in the 80s, looking at this very subject. Was it agronomically possible to grow cereal crops without livestock? And they came up with the conclusion, yes, it was. There was no reason agronomically and fertility-wise why this couldn't be done. So that was quite a good endorsement. It's a shame that trial didn't go on for longer, but it has been done, and I think it has got some great potential.
Okay. John Purdy asks us, he says that you mentioned a new crop that you had just started, which he think was called Colette's. What is Colette's?
Colette's is a cross between kale and Brussels sprouts. We call it the crop that just keeps on giving. We've been picking our Colette's since the end of September, and we're still picking them. They are incredibly productive. They are like a very small kale which grows on a stem. You get hundreds on one stem. They're a beautiful red-green colour. If you can imagine a cross between a red kale and a Brussels sprout, that's what you get. They were bred by Tozers, one of our local seed companies in Surrey. They were bred over a period, it took them 9 years, I think, to come up with this new vegetable. It's an absolute winner, it really is. It's one of our most favourite crops. We love growing it. Our customers love buying it. It's incredibly popular. And it's a great example, banging the drum here for Britain, is a great example of British plant breeding. This is a brand new vegetable that didn't exist 10 years ago, which is now being grown worldwide. In fact, it's grown in many, many countries of the world. It's become incredibly popular. You will see it in supermarkets. They used to be called flower sprouts, and they've been rebranded Colette's, and very, very worthwhile. They are accessible for gardeners to grow. You can buy seed for gardeners. It's a wonderful crop, and I would urge anybody to give it a go. They're absolutely gorgeous. I had some for my dinner tonight, along with some other things.
Well, that's a pretty good endorsement. The question here is, what's the difference between Ramuel wood chippings and standard wood chippings?
Right, so Ramuel wood chip is wood chip which is harvested usually between December and March, when there's no leaves on the tree. So it's brown wood chip, it's fresh wood chip, and it's spread direct on the land. So it doesn't go through a composting process. It doesn't get mixed up with anything else. It goes direct onto the land. It's been used quite a bit in France in years gone by, and also some work's been done in Canada. It's a very new technology for the UK. We've had trials here on the farm for the last 3 years, along with 3 other farms that were trialing Ramuel chip wood, and we've come up with some really interesting data and some very good results. We're absolutely sold on Ramuel chip wood, and we continue to use it. It's very easy to produce, and it's very accessible, and it means you can use your hedgerows if they're suitable, and you can use young timber which perhaps wouldn't be suitable for any other purpose.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for that clear explanation. There's Claire Louise Donnellan from Ireland is asking the question. You talk about green manures. Do you have a favourite one that stands out above others?
Yeah. Yes, a really difficult question, actually, because I love them all. I think if I had to choose a favourite, it depends when you ask me, but at the moment, I think my favourite might be chicory. I am absolutely passionate about chicory. It has a beautiful flower. It grows 2 meters tall. The roots go down 2 meters. It encourages a huge number of insects. It's a great way of bringing fertility onto a farm. It breaks up subsoil. It's got such a lot going for it. Yes, chicory at the moment, but in a few weeks' time, it might be something else. I do like the ones that flower profusely. So Phacelia is another one. Lucerne is a beautiful one too. They all have their own individual beauty. And this is the thing, I think, about venturing into green manures, is you suddenly find a whole new interest there, which you perhaps didn't have in your former growing career, which I've always grown green manures, but I've only really got into experimenting with the whole range of species in the last 20 years. And it's such a big subject. It has such a lot of potential. And, you know, every plant in the world potentially could be a green manure for some purpose.
Mm. I mean, I have to say, I've noticed, you know, even big arable farms over the last few winters, I've seen more and more people are now are putting green manures in.
Absolutely, it's been quite a success story on farm, because you know they get paid to do it. They don't do it for nothing.
No, of course.
They get paid as part of their single payment scheme, and sometimes they behave quite badly and they cut them down before they flower, which is the worst possible thing to do. But at least they're doing something. They are moving in the right direction.
Yes, and of course, you know, not leaving the soil bare over winter is
absolutely. And this is one of the reasons it's being done, is for that reason, to keep soil covered.
So, just suppose there was a group of people who were inspired by this evening's session, and you know, we wanted to set up a Tolhurst Organics here in Bedfordshire. What advice would you give on that topic?
Well, firstly, you need at least one person out of the group who's had experience in horticulture and growing. To go from a garden to a commercial situation is potentially fraught with problems. It really is, because it's a different sort of discipline altogether from a garden. So experience, I think, is really important. Having worked with somebody else is, I would say, absolutely essential. You have to have done this with somebody else first. And then finding the right piece of land. Any land can be made to grow produce. Some is better than others. You're quite lucky in Bedfordshire. You've got predominantly pretty good soils across most of the county. And there is a lot of horticulture in Bedfordshire. It's famous for its Brussels sprouts, or it used to be. So you have access, potentially you have access to quite good land. And also you have quite good climate in Bedfordshire as well. This is not an easy thing to do halfway up a mountain in West Wales. You do need the right sort of soils and the right sort of site, and the right sort of experience to set it up. And then you have to find the customers. Customers are easier to find at a minute, but they're not always. They have been quite elusive in the past.
Yeah, so I mean, talking about customers, would you say that majority of, I mean, you gave us a breakdown, was it 45 and 55% between customers through the farm shop and people who access you via the box scheme? When people sign up to the box scheme, is it on a sort of week by week basis, or do they have to commit for the season?
No, it's week by week. They can opt in and out. We have quite a few of our customers. In fact, over a third of our customers are every other week, because they can't get through a bag of vegetables in a week. So we have quite a few every other week. So no, they can in and out as and when they please, really.
And okay, well that's interesting. Question coming in here from Nick Dent. You mentioned alternative crop trials. What alternative crops are you currently trialing? He's asking.
Yes, we've had several on the go recently. We've had cucumber melons, which is a very small, about the size of a Malteser, but not quite the same shape. And they're a cross between a melon and a cucumber. They're absolutely delicious. Children love them. They look like little bird eggs. They're very sweet. They're a bit of a nuisance to pick. They work really well in pickled in vinegar, which we've been doing, and they sell really well. They're very popular like that. So that's one crop. The other is a very small pepper, which we call a lunchbox pepper. They're very small. In fact, they're probably about as small as pepper. They're not really any bigger than a chili, but they're not hot. So they're very sweet, very useful children. I mean, both these crops, actually, we took both these crops on because we thought they might appeal to children, and they do. And we've done some trials with them in terms of growing. We've also done some consumer work. We've done some surveys with consumers over these two crops, and they have proved to be quite popular. So rather like the Colettes, these are two new crops for UK. They're not newly invented. They've been around in the world for a long time, but they are relatively new to the UK. We've continually trying out new varieties of tomato. We grow about 6 varieties of tomato generally, but on top of that, we always try at least 3 or 4, sometimes more, what we call heritage varieties, because we like the idea of heritage varieties, although their performance is often somewhat lacking, but we do like the sort of the principles behind a heritage variety. So we've done quite a few of those. Last year we had a tomato which was almost black. It didn't taste very nice. That didn't work out. So very often we'd only do it for a year or two, then we'll drop it because perhaps it doesn't perform well. But 1 or 2 we have kept on. The yellow tomato, which we started 20 years ago, called Yellow Submarine. I bought it really because I just like the name. I'm from that era, same as you, I suppose, that we remember Yellow Submarine, and it's been a wonderful variety, and that was a very, very rare variety. So we tend to try out sort of weird and wonderful varieties in the hope that something might stick, and sometimes they do.
Okay, well, here's a comment from Annie. She's saying that the DEFRA's, that's the Department for the Environment and Rural Affairs, DEFRA's gene editing consultation ends on the 17th March. So we've got about a week in which to respond to that. And she's urging everyone to write to DEFRA and tell them that we don't need gene editing. We can do what, perfectly well without it.
Absolutely, yes. I hope everybody does write and make their point known.
Whether they will take any notice of ordinary peeps or not, I really don't know.
They will if enough people pitch in. They will.
Okay, we have a question here regarding crop damage from rabbits, doves, and other animals. Do you just let them have their share, or do you sort of take very active measures to limit?
No, we've had a long experience of dealing with things that want to take our crop, and that's partly what you do as a farmer. You have to manage other consumers as well. I mean, rabbits, we have the entire farm is fenced against rabbits. We have fence. We have almost 2 miles of fencing, so that's one way of keeping them out. But then we had to put badger gates in, because if you don't put badger gates in, the badgers destroy the rabbit netting, and then the rabbits get back in. So we've got about 25 badger gates, and then we have to keep the badgers away from the sweet corn, because they eat sweet corn and also strawberries. So we put netting around that when the crops are in season. So we have to deal with that. And then we have deer wandering around, who actually don't really do any damage at all to the vegetables, but they do sometimes damage the trees. So we have to put guards on the trees. Our biggest problem actually is not mammals or pests at all. They are pests. It's pigeons. Pigeons are our biggest threat. And we have to cover some crops in the winter. So all our brassicas, and we're talking 2 acres almost, we have to cover with crop covers, which is hugely expensive, difficult to manage. Means that harvesting takes longer, but we wouldn't have much left by January if we didn't do that. Interestingly, though, the last 3 years we've had quite a big range of. We have a lot of red kites in the area. We have up to 40 or 50 sometimes following the tractor. We've also got goshawks, and since we've had goshawks, which have been around for about 3 or 4 years, the pigeon population has pretty much vanished. In fact, this year we didn't cover our crops this year at all, and we had almost no damage from pigeons. So just restoring the balance of nature does a lot to keep the pest problem under control. So everything about the farm really is to try and restore that balance of nature. So whereas we've managed to control nearly all our insect problems by, positive biological management, we're also hoping to try and do the same with the bigger predators as well. And we would hope that the goshawks continue to keep the population of pigeons down to tolerable levels. The other reason the pigeon population has dropped in the last 2 years is because of the the ban on neonicotinoids that oilseed rape farmers have had to put up with has meant they don't grow oilseed rape, which is a huge feed source for pigeons and encouraged their population to grow dramatically. So the fact that oilseed rape is not growing anything like the scale it used to be has had a direct impact on the pigeon population. So again, it's really about the way we manage the environment. A lot of our pest problems are not of our making, but of somebody else's making.
Yeah, I mean, just touching on the red kite, which you brought up. I mean, they were an endangered species, weren't they, sort of 15, 20 years ago? And I used to see them in isolated pockets here and there on my travels around the country. But now, you know, I see them pretty much everywhere. And so that's been a tremendous sort of good news in terms of bringing back a species that was, you know, on the brink, I think.
Absolutely.
Now we have
the estate here, we have a lot of woodland here. We have 500 acres of woodland on the estate. It's not my estate, it's my landlord's, but they're hoping to reintroduce some pine martens quite soon to control the grey squirrels, because grey squirrels are an enormous problem, and pine martens will deal with that problem.
Excellent, good, okay. Question here coming in here and regarding perennial vegetables. Do you think there is a commercial viability in growing a wider range of perennial vegetables?
Yes, I love the idea of perennial vegetables, and I did do quite a bit of research into this a few years ago. We have asparagus and we have rhubarb, the normal ones. We have looked at other things. The difficulty with perennial vegetables is, well, there's two problems. One is consumer attitude, and two is trying to get a viable production system which can be managed on a relatively small scale. Because they don't rotate, they tend to be quite problematic in terms, long-term, in terms of weed problems. And this is the barrier for us as commercial growers. It's the time involved in dealing with that particular problem. In asparagus, we do spend quite a bit of time with weeding, more than perhaps most of our other crops. So relatively small return. We do it because we like the crop, but they are difficult to manage, these crops. There's not a huge choice in perennial vegetables. Perennial vegetables have got huge advantages in terms of no land tillage, so no soil disturbance, and longevity. But they do need quite a bit of management. They're not something which you can just kind of fit and forget. You do need to look after them. It's not like in the garden we have one or two plants. You know, we would be dealing with many thousands of plants, and it does take quite a lot of work to keep them productive and healthy. And none of them actually last for very long. The Global Artists, which we've done, after about 4 or 5 years, you have to restart from scratch all over again. So they can be quite labour intensive on our sort of scale.
Okay. Question coming in here asking, what fruits do you grow apart from strawberries, apples, etc.? Do you grow nuts? Can I just also ask, your strawberries, do you grow them in the soil, or do you grow them sort of in the elevated troughs that more and more commercial growers are using now, particularly in polytunnels?
No, strawberries are grown in soil. We're not allowed to grow plants that are not in soil. Organic means you have to grow in soil. There's no organic production of any fruits or vegetables or anything at all unless it's in soil. It has to be in soil. This is one of the fundamental basic principles of organic production. You must grow in soil. So our strawberries are grown in soil. We do get pretty good years. We've been growing strawberries for 45 years. We were the first ever organic strawberry growers in UK, and we still are one of the very few people actually grow strawberries organically in UK. It's quite an unusual crop. We have apples within our agroforestry system. We have nuts within our hedgerows that we planted. We don't get to harvest many nuts because the squirrels usually get there first. We would love to have more nuts. Again, the issue with particularly nuts is really down to labour. It's quite labour intensive in terms of harvest. I mean, all fruits are very, very hard in terms of labour. I mean, we picked 2,000 kilos of strawberries last year. It took 4 people working 6 or 8 hours a day for 45 days to do that. More than half of the value of that crop actually went on paying those people, which is fine. We're quite happy to do that. But if the yield had been low, we would have still paid the same amount of money and maybe not made anything. It's quite difficult making money from fruits and vegetables unless you're doing it on quite a large scale.
Okay. What are the reactions of your fellow farmers or farmer organisations in your vicinity?
We don't have a lot of farms around where we are. I mean, one of our neighbours is a horse equestrian centre.
Okay.
The other neighbour is the farm on the estate. There's a 500-acre farm. He's been here almost as long as me. We're great mates. We get on really well. He farms primarily single suckle beef on a very low input system. He's organic as well. And then we have another neighbour who has alpacas who we never actually see. My neighbour is very supportive. My immediate neighbour very supportive of what we do. We do get a lot of visits from farmers from all over the world. We are a centre for agroecology examples, so we get people coming literally from many countries from all over the world. They come in primarily to see what we're doing because they've heard that we're doing something unusual and they're interested. So in the main, we get a lot of very positive attitudes from farmers about what we do.
Good, excellent. Well, on that topic, we have, I mean, we had someone from Ireland, someone from Belgium. We've now got someone from Arizona, which is well on the other side of the pond. Sabrina Balabushko, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Sabrina, says, hello from Arizona. Thank you for this talk. It's incredibly engaging and very much missing in the US. Veganic agriculture opportunities are slim here. Do you currently have training opportunities for interested students, COVID permitting, or any planned in the future? If so, where can interested folks go to connect with you?
Well, at the moment, unfortunately, we don't have any traineeships. We've stopped doing them for a couple of years. We needed a break, actually. We may well be reinstating it in the future. So maybe if the lady was to email us, we could put her name on file and get back to her. There are people doing this in US, and there is a movement in US now for organic farms. So maybe it would be worth finding out a bit more about that. And Arizona, yes, an interesting place to be going. I've been there. It's pretty dry for the most part. Yes, you'll need to find some rainfall, I think.
Okay, well, Sabrina, if you're still with us and still listening, have a look closer to home and contact Iain via the Tolhurst Organics website.
I believe there's quite a bit going on in California, as one would imagine, because California has quite a large horticulture industry already. Yes. There are quite a few veganic farms in California starting up.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. I noticed that we're now sort of past 9 o'clock. Are you happy to carry on a little bit more, Iain? We've got some more questions here being thrown at you.
Yeah, we're getting some very interesting questions, so let's keep going.
Okay, well, excellent. All right. Laura Schuring asks, I'd love to know what Iain thinks are the biggest barriers to others following this system. The biggest barriers to people following the system that you run, Iain?
Well, the biggest barrier, I think we've already discussed, the biggest barrier is lack of experience and knowledge and lack of housing in rural areas.
So this is where an organisation like the Ecological Land Cooperative, which is admittedly a very small scale operation in the UK, but my understanding is that they're trying to sort of enable small holdings to start up with I think they're basically buying up smallish plots of land and subdividing it into, I don't know, 5-10 acres or so, with some basic accommodation on there so that new entrants can actually kickstart that. And I think they've got about 4 or 5 projects up and down the country. So yeah, maybe the Ecological Land Cooperative is a website that you need to visit.
Yes, definitely. The ELC have been very proactive in this, and I've done some advisory work for them. I've been in contact with them quite a bit over the years. We need more organisations like ELC to set up initiatives of this type, and they have been incredibly successful actually in getting planning applications for people to live on land and develop businesses. They are only take people that have got proven experience, so it's not for complete and total starters. We still need a process where people can really get the grassroots experience. You need to have several years under your belt before ELC will consider you for one of their land shares.
What's your thinking of the biodynamic college down in is it West Sussex?
Yeah, Forest Row. Yes,
Forest
Row. I know all these people because I visit them quite a bit. They visit me. Yeah, a very useful organisation. It tends to be usually very small scale, and much of their sort of farms tend to be linked to social welfare with local people, which is a wonderful thing to be doing. So they are getting support from local government and local councils and social services in terms of looking after people with disabled and learning difficulties, which is a wonderful way of using horticulture. So they're not always strictly commercial farms, but they are very credible and they do a really good job. They've been very successful in terms of helping other people with learning difficulties through horticulture.
And of course, they're very much based around sort of Steiner's biodynamic principles, aren't they? So very, very clearly in a different area from vegan organic, because I think
yes, but not wildly different. There is actually one biodynamic farm which had decided not to use any animal inputs at all, which is quite interesting. Okay. And they seem to be going along quite nicely. We're not comparing ourselves with biodynamic in terms of we don't think we're any better than them and they don't think they're any better than us. So we kind of coexist and we respect each other's principles. We just think that why bother with animals when you can do without? If you don't need them, why use them? So that's how we kind of fit in around what they can do.
Okay. Interesting question here from Nigel Barnes, who's saying rather than I think trim our hedges with a flail every second year, we should be coppicing them every 7 to 10 years, and then he suggests they should be chipped for compost. But the interesting thing here is I think he's asking, what would the locals think of these hedges that are not trimmed? Do you have any hedges which adjoin roads and so on?
Yes, we have quite a bit of our hedge adjoins roads, and we have to, whenever we do any coppicing, we have to put a sign up because people think we're taking the hedge out. So we have to educate people as to what we're doing. So we explain what we're doing. And some of our hedges we've laid in traditional manner as well. That can look quite drastic. Overgrown hedges can be actually quite unproductive. Beyond a certain size, they lose biodiversity rather than gain it. So very overgrown hedges are actually usually quite useless in terms of environmental interaction. So hedges do need management. Some hedges are not suitable for coppicing. If they're very, very old, and many of our hedges in the UK are very old, they may not be able to be coppiced without serious rehabilitation in terms of new planting. So it's not always possible, but ideally a hedge should be able to be coppiced and provide important raw materials. And in fact, in days gone by, all hedges were managed in that way. It's only in the last 50 to 100 years that we've started to use these horrible mowers for flailing off, which actually is very, very destructive of the environment, and particularly if it's done on an annual basis. If it's only done once every 4 to 5 years, it's far less damaging. And we have a very positive hedgerow management policy on the farm. We never cut them down completely unless we're going to coppice them, and we only trim them. When we do trim them, we only trim one side every 4 to 5 years. We allow them to go full height, and that increases the biological diversity of the hedge. Okay.
There's a question here regarding climate change. It says, how has your farm had to adapt to climate change? Because you've been there, is it 33 years at where you are now? So yes. What changes have you noticed, and what adaptations have you had to implement?
Well, we have noticed changes, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, the changes have been more dramatic. I mean, the mild winters have meant that we can actually produce some crops for longer than we used to. So there's been some positives, but also there's been some negatives as well. I mean, we've had increased flooding from the river over the last 15 years. You know, it's flooded more than 15 years it did 15 years before. So we have had to make some changes. We're continually looking at the farm in terms of building resilience. And one of the great resilient factors of our farm is the fact is that we grow a whole range of different crops. So if we were to lose a crop to any specific weather event, then it's only a very small part of the total farm. We haven't actually lost any crops on the farm at all for the last 4 or 5 years. And this is, in my history of farming, it's unprecedented. We always used to lose crops for some reason or the other. So we kind of feel we're in a fairly good place at the moment. Temperature change has definitely, you know, we are seeing much warmer conditions. There's no doubt about that. I mean, we've had a cold spell the last 2 or 3 weeks, but, you know, not that cold. It's something which, you know, because it happens very slowly, you don't see the big changes. I mean, we know it's happening because we've got the history going back and the data going back for so many hundreds of years in this country. So we know it's happening, but they are quite subtle changes. So it hasn't made a huge difference to us. I mean, we have had some torrential rainfall, and we're very resilient to that because we keep our ground covered most of the time. We rarely have bare soil for very long at all. So, and when we do, we're cultivating it in a special way because we've got increased organic matter level. That gives us resilience to soil damage. It also gives us resilience to long-term drought. So, you know, we have managed to build resilience in just improving soil organic matter in itself is a big factor in resilience to climate change.
So in terms of maintaining productivity in periods of drought, you're relying on improving the soil through the organic matter rather than, for example, setting up on-farm storage ponds for water, etc., etc.
No, we have extensive irrigation. We have
Oh, you do?
A very dry part of the country. We wouldn't do any of this without irrigation. So we have borehole into the bedrock, and we're pumping water. And we do that most years. It's very rare we don't use irrigation. Mm-hmm. Most vegetable growers in the UK, in the south, have to use irrigation. We don't use excessive amount. In fact, we use quite a lot less than a conventional grower would do, but we do use it. We wouldn't be getting crops without it.
Okay, all right. A gentleman called Rich Hardy. Brilliant talk, Iain. I'm a new veganic grower with a 1 acre market garden in Cornwall. Any experience using hotbeds for seedlings, and how do you make them veganic?
Yes, he needs to go to a Facebook site, and it's called Wood Chip for Soil Health. It's one I set up a year or two ago, and in there he'll find reference to wood chip hotbeds for plant raising. It's been done quite a bit. It's quite a popular system. It works very well. So Wood Chip for Soil Health Facebook page.
Okay, well, there you are, Rich, and thank you for joining us all the way from Cornwall, the wonders of Zoom. Okay, so I think we've taken up more than of your time at 9:15. I would like to thank you on behalf of the BCCF committee and indeed all of our viewers this evening. I think we had something like over 70 people watching at the peak. So thank you very much again for that, Iain. And we wish you well in a good growing season without too many adverse events.
Well, yes, well, we don't mind the odd adverse events. It keeps you on your toes. We just don't want too many one after the other.
Okay, now, before people start logging off, I'd just like to draw your attention to dates for your diary. Lucy tells me that on April the 10th, our event is focusing on an award-winning global Bedford-based business that has made a dramatic transformation to be carbon net zero and zero waste in less than 18 months. So it is possible, hopefully inspiring some other businesses. So that's on the April the 10th. And then the following one is going to be on May the 12th, which will also be based on an agricultural theme, but we haven't nailed the details of that one yet. So more details will follow in the normal way to our mailing list. So Iain, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. It's been really interesting. I haven't read out all of the comments, but everyone has been very supportive, saying what a wonderful presentation it's been. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me here, and I'm pleased it's been of use to everybody, and I hope that they can take a little bit of something away with them tonight.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Colin, if you'd like to say any final words.
Well, no, I just think that Iain is so inspiring. There was a comment from Pip Sadler to the effect that wouldn't it be wonderful if we could see farms like Iain springing up all over Bedfordshire and supplying our local towns. That would be my vision. I think that we need something like this, even if it goes alongside other forms of growing. Something like Iain's wonderful, wonderful work needs to be established. It needs to be grown on, doesn't it? I think that you mentioned, or Iain himself suggested clonings of Tolly. I think that's absolutely something that we need. But in my mind, there are some questions about how we do that. And do we need a whole change of system, or is it down to individuals and small groups? I think that still remains for us. But thank you so much, Iain. It's been truly, truly inspirational, as so many people have said.
Well, thank you. I mean, to add to that, Colin, I think, change of government policy is the thing which would make a huge difference. It really could. And, there is a change in the offing. We've got rid of basic payment scheme, or we're getting rid of basic payment scheme, and going into the environmental land management scheme, which is putting more pressure on farmers and growers to really start looking after the environment in a completely different way. They're not going to be paid just for having a farm any longer. They're only going to get paid if they actually do something in terms of delivering public goods. We actually stand to do very well in these payments because we tick all the boxes which they have set up. We don't know at the moment what the detail is because it's been a bit slow coming because of Brexit, but farmers are going to have to be much more proactive in terms of looking after their soils, their hedgerows, their biodiversity, their water quality, their air quality. All these things will be paid for by the government, and also probably carbon retention and carbon fixation as well. So there is a huge opportunity, and this would also include establishment of businesses similar to ours, which, as you say, would be fantastic. We would be more than happy to see, another dozen or more businesses such as ours within the sort of the 12, 15-mile radius of where we are, because there's a huge potential for this to happen. And it sets a precedent for other people in the future, and indeed some larger farms as well. So we hope that the government policy with agriculture, the new policy, is going to be much more favourable in the future. We can only wait to see. We have yet to see the detail.
I think, Iain, that you are a grower in this this wider, profound sense of offering a vision and also giving us very practical examples of how it could be achieved. So I think it's wonderful. And I noticed your use of the word ethical as well. I have felt that you are a deeply caring and ethical farmer in the most inspiring way. And this is so important for us. So many, many thanks again for coming and joining us this evening in Bedfordshire. My pleasure. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Iain. Good night. Well, for those people that are still online, maybe what BCCF should try and do is maybe do a questionnaire or something like that via our MailChimp mailing list. So if you're not on our mailing list, perhaps I will urge you to join it. Obviously, if it gets too burdensome, you can always unsubscribe. We're not in the business of flogging you stuff that you don't need. Maybe perhaps it'd be interesting just send a one-line email to us and say yes, you'd be interested in seeing something like Tolhurst Organics here in Bedfordshire. And then we'll see where we go from there. We'll see if we can, pick this up and actually run with it. I'm sure there's lots of advice that we can get from various agencies that would be that would perhaps suggest we do like a community interest company, something along the lines of Tolhurst Organics or something different. But let's just see if we can actually develop a project here and see where we go. And then, of course, we've got just the little problems of finding the land and finding the money and finding the grower. But all things are possible, aren't they? So with that, I'll stop rambling. Urge you to, if you are interested, just drop us a quick line to say yes, you'd be interested in trying to pursue something, and then we'll see where we can go from there. And maybe we can pick this up again in a couple of months' time at our May event. So thank you very much, everyone, and I wish you good night, and thank you for joining us.
Can I thank you for your lovely chairing of the event, Ivan, as well?
Oh, well, thank you very much. Yes.